Well, welcome. I'm Debra Brown, CEO of Governance Solutions. I'm joined today by David Brown, my partner in life and business. And David, I know you've been chatting away, but here's your opportunity to say a more formal hello.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. Welcome to the session. Glad you could join us.
Yeah, so this world of equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, it's broad, it's deep, it's complicated, and it's always changing. It's as we said in the chat earlier, it's a journey that we're all on and everyone's learning. And so over the next half hour or so, we're going to be focusing on this topic that we've called EDI or DEI. Which is it? Is it equity, diversity, inclusion, or is it diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what's the difference? And does it even matter? And why does the inclusion challenge always seem to come and be left for the last when we think about inclusion? So let's talk just briefly about order, and order matters. One of the things David and I are known for is making order out of chaos. And so to us, order matters, and it helps us in all areas of life and business when we think about things through the lens of order. And so in many ways, equity is actually, and this might disrupt people a little bit, but equity is more important than diversity and inclusion. And so why do I say that? I say that because without equity, diversity and inclusion will never hit the needed depths for really true transformation, to be really an organization that's equitable, diverse, and inclusive. You can't do that if you're not equitable. Equity is important and order matters. So we're going to unpack that a little bit. And I wanted to add with that question, is it EDI or DEI? What do other people say about it? Because you can look at different organizations, different universities, different countries, and some use DEI and some use EDI, and some people are just really entrenched on one side or another. And so what are they saying about it? And so I've got some bullet points here on some of the things that they say. And the first is that equity will have more impact than merely focusing on, sorry, I've lost my screen here, focusing on diversity or even inclusion. And this is a little like what I just said. Without equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts really only kind of touch the surface. You never really go deep. Some people just argue it because of simple grammar. It's about the grammatical convention in English for word lists is to list them in alphabetical order. So it's really difficult for some people to say EDI. It's outside of grammatical order. So we get DEI. But DEI isn't just a list of words. It's a conceptual construct that needs an orderly acronym, shall we say, that matches the construct. It's not a to-do list. And I think a lot of organizations get really challenged in equity, diversity, and inclusion because they think of it as a to-do list, as a checklist. But it's really a construct. So another thing that we hear people saying is that diversity has baggage. So let's change the order up to get people to think more about equity. What they say is that, for over 30 years, corporations, organizations, educational institutes, they've purportedly been doing diversity while workforces have maybe becoming a little more diverse on the outside. They're not really becoming more equitable or inclusive on the inside. So they think perhaps an order change is going to change the focus. And so they say, let's change this to EDI, to equity first. Another thing we hear is that equity resonates more globally. And if you think about those words, equity, diversity, and inclusion, they tend to resonate the word equity resonates more at a sort of a global level. Every day the world seems to be getting smaller. Immigration is everywhere. People are moving all the time for a variety of reasons. And so this global push for equity and real-time connectivity expands the purview of what's traditionally been understood as diversity-based efforts, particularly here in the West. Others are saying diversity can be represented, but equity can be embedded. And so authentic and deeply integrated equity-based work goes far beyond traditional diversity aims of, say, employee engagement or hiring or representation goals and metrics and things like that. It goes far beyond that. And I guess the sixth main reason that we hear is that people who put equity first are confusing equality with equity or equity with equality. And perhaps, but not necessarily. There are two different concepts. Equity and equality, they're similar, but they are two completely different things. So sometimes when we see people do EDI, we hear them call it equality, diversity and inclusion, and really equality is different than equity, similar but different. And so while arguments, some compelling, others not so much so, perhaps a better approach might be to be clear on order and be clear on what we mean by our words. And words have power, and so you want to know what you mean by those words. What do we mean by these words? So here's what we say about it. And here's why we prefer to use the EDI order. In fact, I would prefer to call it EEDI, though perhaps somewhat simplistic. It helps me when I think about equality, the first E of the EEDI, of equality, as the why. Equity is the how, diversity is the who, and inclusion as the what. And so let me I'm going to break those down a bit, then I'm going to take a breath and let David talk. But firstly, think about equity as the why, the first of my two EEs, equality as the why. And it's the why equity, diversity, and inclusion matter to begin with, is equality. That's what we really all want to get to ultimately, is this starts with the basic understanding that we're all an equally part of a single race, human race, and as such, we should be considered equally. We're all wanting to be considered equally. So that's really the why of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And equity is really all about the how. Equity is how we ensure people are treated with fairness and justice, and therefore afforded equal opportunity regardless of their differences. And so this means how we approach diverse individuals may differ depending on their circumstances, so that they too can experience their human right to equality. So equity is how you get to equality. And diversity is more about the who. And sometimes we've started with diversity thinking, if we just get people who look a little different from us, we're diverse and okay, we've done it. But that's really about the who. Diversity is a reflection of how people differ in their attributes, ranging from whether that's ethnic and race to gender, sexual orientation, cultural norms and expectations, and any other differences people may have or encounter. So for example, what do they look like? What do they think like? What do they feel like? What do they talk like? What do they act like? So diversity is much more about the who, the person. And then inclusion is really the what. And inclusion determines specifically what you can do to approach, support, encourage, and engage people amidst that diversity. And so this ranges from recognition of those who may have been traditionally marginalized, to the proactive provision of equitable opportunity, to access, to resources, to support, and to other intangibles like respect and honor and understanding and grace. And inclusion is impacted by and through leadership levels and styles and engagement and policy setting. And so that's how we sort of frame when we think about EDI, is that it's about ultimately the why, equality. How we do that is through, through equity. And we do that by being diverse through the person, the who, and inclusion is really the what and how that gets impacted. And I think as we're going to talk about the inclusion challenge, because we have a lot of diversity happening now, but people aren't being included and they're leaving organizations in droves because of that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit too. Anyway, that's the framework. That's how I think. So David, I'm going to just flip this over to you. And what do you think?
Yeah, well, thank you, Debra. And I think that you've described really well the kind of high-level perspective in terms of what's the difference between those four words and how do they fit together, in terms of whether you want to call it a hierarchy or a chain or an organic kind of dynamic. And at the end of the day, I'm going to describe a couple of different things, what we call the vicious cycle and the virtuous cycle. And what I want you to do as we go through this is to be thinking about your own organization and where you might be, which of these describes your organization better. And it's probably no surprise that the second big idea of our session here today is that most organizations get tripped up on the I. The D, as Debra has described it, is a systematic process that you can achieve with some work and some persistence and some organization and some resources. But the I is really about culture. It's about the climate. It's about how people are made to feel. Do they have a sense of belonging? Do they have a sense of engagement? And as we all know, culture is way more important and yet way more difficult to change than structure. And so let's take a look at what we mean by the inclusion challenge and where does this usually break down in an organization. Overcoming the inclusion challenge is the key to succeeding and becoming a truly equitable, diverse, and inclusive organization and board, leading to becoming more likely to outperform those that don't. Organizations have been doing a good job, a reasonably good job of checking the equity and diversity boxes, but they're getting tripped up when it comes to inclusion. They're wasting time and money and ending up worse off than when they started. In many cases, they've actually stirred up a whole hornet's nest in an organization by saying they're going to embrace equity and diversity without addressing inclusion. And even organizations that do well in equity and diversity can create more human resources problems than they solve if they don't overcome this inclusion challenge. Now, some of you may have heard me share these examples before, but I think it's worth reflecting on them. They're real life examples, firsthand experience that Debra and I ran into with clients recently. One of them is a major corporate board. They engaged a leading global search firm to recruit the perfect candidate. They wanted to embrace diversity. They knew their shareholders and their stakeholders were looking over their shoulders and they were not doing well at diversity in the boardroom. So they took the plunge, got a global search firm, and they found them an individual with impeccable credentials, great qualifications and experience, a good match for the sector, the industry, the organization, the strategy. Also happened to be a woman of color, and they recruited her onto the board. But only 3 board meetings in, it was clear things were not working out. There was no sense of belonging. She was in the boardroom, but she was being tuned right out. The rest of the board was this elite clique, and it just wasn't. It had absolutely no inclination of even how to reach out to and include and engage this new board member. And after 3 board meetings, She tendered her resignation. An amazing recruit was lost. That's a great example of the inclusion challenge at a board level. And the second example I have is a young South Asian professional who migrated from South Asia to Saskatchewan, encouraged to settle in Saskatchewan when they came to Canada, recruited through efforts to improve equity and diversity in the province, and with promises of inclusion, engagement, mobility, promotion. So 2 years later, I happened to be working with him on a project for a client in Saskatchewan, and he told me, you know, confidentially, I'm not going to be here much longer. I'm actively planning to move to either Toronto or Vancouver. And I said, oh, that's really disappointing. Why? And he said, I look at the leaders here, the leaders in government, the leaders at big corporations, my employer, other employers, even not-for-profit corporations here in Saskatchewan. And I'm just not seeing people like me. How many more years is it going to take for me to be recognized or included in leadership? And so they decided, I'm not going to keep trying to swim, you know, upstream against the tide. I'm leaving. So these organizations are just two examples of organizations that invested money, efforts, you know, resources in equity and diversity, recruited, hired, trained amazing people, and then they lost them for a lack of inclusion.
Well, thanks, David. And so I guess that leads to the question, why do you feel people have a challenge with inclusion?
Yeah, so this brings us to what I mentioned, the vicious exclusion cycle. So let me kind of walk you through what we're seeing. And that is, if you have a climate that's not inclusive, that's uninclusive, or you might call it an exclusive climate, this naturally leads to distrust and disrespect. And so disrespect are just examples, you know, microaggression is a good example of a disrespect in the workplace where someone just treats someone else in a manner that is not a manner of equality. It's you know, I'm better than you, I'm smarter than you, you got to listen to me, I know more than you do. And so incidences of disrespect and distrust, what we mean by that is trust is when you expect the other person across the table to be acting in the best interest of the group. And so distrust is when you don't fully trust that someone's acting in the best interest of the group. So you withhold information, you control information, you skew information, you know, you bias information, you're much more likely to direct than dialogue, to argue than listen. And so these incidences of disrespect and distrust in the workplace lead to this sense of inequity, this lack of fairness, this lack of feeling belonging in an organization among employees. And that leads to negative self-image and disrespect for oneself sometimes. Sometimes that can occur in the vicious cycle, is people get treated that way. And unless they've got really kind of strong characters able to resist those kinds of disrespect and distrust eroding them, their own self-image gets eroded. And that either way hampers teamwork, engagement, productivity. You don't have a free flow of information that you would when you have trust. You don't have people rolling up their sleeves and working in cohesive social teams the way you would if you had respect. And that leads to unfulfilled, dissatisfied people at work and at home, to low engagement, low productivity, low creativity, low innovation. And at the end of the day, a lack of originality, lack of innovation, lack of new business ideas. And we have very good research that tells us that there's a direct correlation between a drop-off in inclusion and engagement and a drop-off in results, in corporate organizational results. And that the reason we call it a vicious cycle is it just feeds on itself. You get more and more disrespect, more and more distrust, more and more control. And so how can you fix it? It is this virtuous inclusion cycle. This is where you're headed. This is what you're seeking to do. You're seeking to build an inclusive climate which leads to trust and respect, leads to a sense of belonging, positive self-image, and self-respect for oneself, to teamwork, engagement, productivity, to self-actualization and connection at work and at home. That leads to enhanced engagement, productivity, creativity, and that leads to innovation and corporate results. And that then is a virtuous cycle that builds trust and respect. People are more likely to share with one another. So let me see if I can, yeah. So I wanted to walk through here the specific steps that we can take in order to do that. I just don't know if I can do that and share my screen at the same time.
Do you want me to share mine?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
All right.
I'm good. All right. So let's just go through some practical steps that we can take to fix it. So building a virtuous cycle of inclusion begins with trust and respect. An inclusive climate sets the expectation for trust and respect in the workplace, and that develops and establishes a sense of belonging. So where does that begin? It begins with the organization setting clear expectations. So that means a robust code of conduct that's informed by and aligned with a clearly articulated EDI strategy. So at a board level, you got two documents, an EDI strategy, and then a clearly articulated code of conduct underneath that, from the boardroom to the workplace. And you've heard us say, you don't get what you plan, you get what you resource, you get what you measure, and what you reward. So that means in addition to having a clear EDI strategy and code of conduct, you want to integrate that into your strategic plan, into your corporate scorecard and risk tolerances, into your policies and budget, your human resources plan, your performance management, compensation, and disclosures. The whole governance cycle. The whole governance cycle is embedded with equity, diversity, and inclusion. You'll want to, before you go much further down the road, take some baseline measures of your equity, diversity, and inclusion. You want to be clear about where you stand currently, then set some realistic milestone targets. Where do we expect to be 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 18 months from now? And yes, this is going to take time. And we'll share with you at the end of the session here our new EDI assessment tool. That's one way you can measure your EDI. So what you're doing here is building an inclusive culture. And we know from research that changing culture involves 4 steps: structure, orientation, education, and dialogue. And those 4 steps are repeated in a cycle over and over again. So we've started by talking about strategy and policy structure, but more importantly, you need orientation, education, and dialogue. This means people meeting together in groups of different sizes, from large gatherings in the organization to make sure we all hear the message about EDI strategy and expected conduct and behavior, and then smaller groups, workplace groups, even smaller groups than that, micro culture teams in the organization, to learn about the stumbling blocks to an inclusive workplace. And it's more than just one meeting and one training session. It's an ongoing process. Yes, it includes mandatory training on EDI at all levels, the board, the front line, but it goes beyond that to a series of informal social exchanges where we listen deeply to one another and get to know one another deeply. So you want to recruit an external resource, unless you have someone in-house that is a very strong resource when it comes to EDI, someone who's able to take your organization through this education, orientation, dialogue process, and someone who's skilled at using fictional scenarios and simulations and role plays to get people holding up the mirror to themselves and talking to one another about how they feel in terms of a sense of belonging. And most workplaces will continue to experience unconscious yet systemic biases that negatively impact inclusion. They really need to be rooted out like you would weed a garden. And that's why you need a strong facilitator. You need good measures. You need good feedback mechanisms. You need trust that people will open up and share their own stories in order to build awareness and empathy and reinforce trust. You know, discrimination, microaggression, privileged behavior, these are deeply rooted in people. And this is not a one and done process. You're going to need more targeted facilitation for some, mentoring, coaching, more formal education programs. And if you succeed here, you are able to retain skilled, talented employees, and yet they're also able to contribute to an inclusive climate and culture. Every person brings value to the organization. Everyone inherently has value to bring and to offer. And so these sessions and this whole program of EDI builds a sense of belonging in everyone, right down to the very last person realizing the value that everyone else in the group offers and brings. You're now building momentum to a virtuous cycle. A sense of belonging among employees builds positive self-image and respect. That builds teamwork, engagement, productivity. A positive self-image, along with trust, respect, belonging, helps people to be their full, authentic selves. That leads to self-actualization, not only at work, but at home, as they connect with their team and with their families. This is Maslow's hierarchy. You're building self-actualization in people, and self-actualized people are more engaged, productive, creative. That drives innovation and builds organizational results. It'll contribute to organizational effectiveness, and you'll reap the long-term benefits of your investment in EDI. Self-actualized people will treat everybody with trust and respect, and that's how the virtuous cycle is fed and grows in strength, in momentum, in sustainability. And what do they say? Repeat. You then just repeat that cycle over and over again.
Wash, rinse, repeat.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think that's how that goes. Well, thanks, David. That was like a really great overview. And I think if you've all been watching in the chat, you'll see some comments there from Leanne Belgard. And so very appreciative of that. This is such a huge topic, so it's always great when other people are adding value to the discussion. I don't know where you are all at in your EDI or DEI journey, but I do know that one of the first steps you can take as a board member is to be a leader in creating and embedding an inclusive culture, is to be sure that you know where you're headed directionally. So it helps to ensure that the organization has articulated its EDI purpose. We've talked about that a little bit. And so, David, I know we have some questions that we've kind of made a list of questions that you can ask as board members that will help you build an EDI purpose statement. Do you want to just go over those, David?
Yeah, let's put up the next slide. Here we go. So here's some questions you can ask yourself to articulate your organization's EDI purpose. What does equity look like in our workforce? What does a diverse workforce look like? What does an inclusive culture look like? What is the purpose of measuring EDI? What sparked an interest in improving EDI? Who will be informed of the purpose? What are the outcomes you hope to achieve? What does success look like?
Yeah, thanks for that, David, because I think this is just, these questions are there just to create dialogue. You talked earlier about coming together in groups in order to kind of work through what this what these things look like. And these are really good questions to spark that dialogue, to really get to understand, listen to and understand the perspectives of people in your organization. I mean, at the end of the day, is it EDI or DEI? I think you probably all saw in the chat, there were a bunch of other ideas came up. One of them was actually IDEA, IDEA, where they add, they start with inclusion. So inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. There's another one in the chat, EDID. And so they add decolonization at the end of EDI, but they use the EDI order. There's a JEDI that includes justice. There's DEI, DEIB, like there's all different ways that people put it. And I think as we all are learning and growing and trying to understand what this all means for us, it's changing, and people are going, but what about this? What about justice? What about decolonization? What about indigenization? What about all of these other things? And so letters are getting added. And I think at the end of the day, that's why I just try and focus on why are we doing this? How are we going to do it? Who is it about? I just think that's sometimes a little bit easier for me. So anyway, at the end of the day, people are going to argue for EDI. People are going to argue for DEI. People are going to argue for some of these other constructs that they have. I prefer EDI just because it's simple and order matters to me. And so if I really understand and get equity, then diversity and inclusion will flow from that. But at the end of the day, as long as you're doing all three, as long as you are equitable, as long as you are diverse and you are inclusive, we don't need to fight about the order or the words or the acronyms. We just need to be equitable, diverse, and inclusive. So lastly, I guess, David, how will you know if you're succeeding at EDI? I guess you've kind of answered that. You said measure. I would say you want to assess it. We've created this EDI baseline assessment tool that David alluded to, and it's going to provide, I think, an excellent baseline assessment to help you understand where you are in terms of the progress you're making towards equity, towards diversity, towards inclusion. And it asks the questions directly related to that, big picture questions, but also, are these pieces in place? Because if these specific pieces aren't in place for equality, diversity, and inclusion, it means you probably haven't thought about it, and you may need to go back a step or two. So it's I think a pretty good assessment for that. It's free. You can find it at this link. I encourage you to use it, to share it, and let me know if it adds value. Let me know if you think we should make changes on it or if it's working for you. I always like to know if something's going to be of value, or if it's not being of value, I want to know that too. So I hope you use it. I hope you find value in it. And David, back to you.
Thanks for that, Debra. Appreciate it.